You were the one who never shouted, the one who listened more than you spoke, the one who let things go, even when they cut too deep. You weren't loud. You weren't dramatic. You didn't push back. You let people talk over you, let them write the story and tell it however they liked. You gave chances, let things slide, believed that if you kept being good, it would come back around, that if you loved hard enough, it would change things. They saw that and assumed you were easy to break. They thought you were someone they could step over without consequence, that you'd stay small, stay soft, stay silent. They mistook your grace for weakness. They thought your patience meant you had no limits, that your kindness was submission, that your forgiveness was permission. You noticed the way they spoke to you, like your emotions were something to joke about. You're too sensitive. You take things personally. Why do you always overthink? And every time they said it, it chipped at you. Not because you believed them, but because you were trying so hard to not be a burden, to not be the problem. You held in your hurt like it was shameful. You wore your silence like armor, even though it was slowly suffocating you. You tried to stay soft in places that kept cutting you. You showed up for people who didn't even notice when you were breaking. You waited for effort from people who only showed up when it was convenient, and they knew it. They knew you'd stay. They knew you'd answer. They knew you'd give them another chance. You made it easy. You made it safe for them to keep playing their games. They thought they had you figured out, that your loyalty meant they'd never lose you, that you were too afraid to be alone, that you needed them more than they needed you. But they were wrong. What you needed was honesty. What you wanted was peace. What you craved was something real, but they never gave it. They kept feeding you silence, giving you less, hoping bare minimum, and you kept hoping it would change. But something happened. You started to see things clearly. The tone in their voice, the absence in their actions, the way they watched you struggle and didn't care, the way they made you feel like your emotions were too much while giving nothing at all. You started to notice patterns, the late replies, the coldness, the backhanded compliments, the half-hearted apologies, and you stopped accepting them as normal. It wasn't anger that changed you, it was clarity. You started to pull back, not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you were tired of hurting, tired of being the one who cared more, tired of showing up fully in places where you were only half seen. You didn't scream, you didn't explain, you just stopped chasing, stopped begging, stopped proving. You didn't notice right away. They thought it was temporary, that you'd come back like always, that once you calmed down, you'd return to your role. But something had shifted, and it wasn't emotional, it was internal, permanent. You had been buried under everyone else's expectations, quietly carrying pain that no one wanted to acknowledge. But you were never weak. You were just tired of being dismissed. They laughed when you talked about your dreams, made jokes when you shared your thoughts, minimized your efforts, pretended not to see your growth. And you let them. You kept thinking that if you stayed humble, they'd eventually respect you. But humility without boundaries turns into invisibility, and you were done being They underestimated you because you didn't fight dirty, because you didn't need to raise your voice to make your point, because you had heart, because you had hope. But they didn't realize what happens when someone like you stops explaining themselves. What happens when you stop waiting for them to care? They didn't see it coming. You rose quietly, without their support, without their recognition, without their validation. You rose because you had to, because something inside you refused to stay broken, because you realized that their opinion of you was built on the version of yourself that didn't know your worth. And once you met the version that did, there was no going back. They still talk like they know you, still speak about who you were, but they don't see who you've become. They don't know the strength it took to not fight back, the strength it took to walk away from what was killing you, the strength it took to love people who never gave you what you deserved, and to still not hate them. You were never weak. They just weren't looking close enough. They only saw what they wanted to see, and they missed the fire building beneath your quiet. They missed the way your silence shifted from fear to awareness to power. They thought you were fragile, but fragility bends. You broke and then rebuilt in silence. And now they watch, they scroll, they ask around, but it's too late. You're already gone, and not because you disappeared, but because you finally rose, and you didn't take them with you. You didn't fall apart in front of anyone. You didn't cry loud enough for someone to check in. You didn't text anyone that you were breaking. You just did, quietly, in small pieces, when no one was looking, behind smiles, behind polite nods, behind showing up to rooms you didn't feel safe in. You laughed when expected. You answered when asked, but no one heard the silence in your tone. No one caught the pause in your breath, and you never corrected them. They thought you were okay, said you looked strong, that you handled things well, that you were resilient. They saw you moving forward and assumed the weight was gone, but it wasn't. It just got heavier. You were carrying disappointment layered under fake peace, carrying heartbreak that hadn't even been named. You didn't have space to fall apart because no one knew how to hold you when you did. So you became your own silence. There were nights where you sat up alone, not thinking, just feeling everything at once, the things you didn't say, the love you gave that wasn't returned, the conversations that left marks, the betrayals that came in whispers, not war. It wasn't one moment that broke you. It was the repetition, the slow erosion of who you were trying to be. You kept bending, hoping someone would notice you were near breaking. They didn't. You showed up for people who didn't deserve you. You listened to voices that never asked how yours sounded. You made room for people who wouldn't move an inch for you. And you convinced yourself that this was kindness, that love meant staying quiet when hurt, that loyalty meant never complaining. So you swallowed it, over and over, until silence became your personality, until "I'm fine" became believable. But you weren't fine. You were exhausted, not physically, emotionally, mentally, from always having to be the strong one, the forgiving one, the understanding one. You gave too many passes, let too many things slide. You brushed off words that pierced your self-worth. You excused behavior you should have walked away from, because leaving felt heavier than staying, because silence felt safer than being misunderstood. You broke at 2 a.m., not because of what happened that day, but because of what had been happening for months, for years. People kept taking, kept testing, kept measuring your worth by how little you asked for in return, and you kept giving, kept waiting for someone to notice you were tired, that maybe you needed a kind word, a safe place. But people only see what benefits them. They don't notice the strength it takes just to not fall apart. Though you held it in, you went quiet in conversations. You started replying slower, started leaving messages unread, not to be rude, but because even texting back felt heavy. You weren't avoiding people. You were avoiding another moment of pretending you were okay, pretending their half-effort didn't hurt, pretending you weren't breaking in slow motion. You'd wake up and put on the same routine: coffee, smile, reply, work, laugh, and then go home and collapse into a silence no one ever asked about. People would say, "You're so strong," and you'd nod. But strength isn't always something you choose. Sometimes it's what's left when you have no other option. When falling apart publicly feels like one more thing you have to apologize for. You wanted someone to notice, to say, "Are you really okay?" and mean it. To hold your silence and not fill it with advice. To just sit there and let you be broken without trying to fix it. But no one came. And that's when you realized you were alone in this. You weren't the priority. You were the dependable one. The one they call when they need comfort. Never the one they check on when things are too quiet. So you stopped expecting, stopped hoping. You didn't become numb. You became still, cold but not cruel, distant but not bitter. You still cared. You just stopped showing it where it wasn't safe. Your silence became armor, not because you didn't want to speak, but because speaking had never been met with listening. The breakdowns happened in your own space, in your car, in your shower, in the back of your throat before meetings, in glances you forced into smiles. You'd feel your chest tighten for no reason. You'd feel the tears push forward, then pull them back. You got good at that, at hiding, at carrying it well enough for people to stay comfortable around you. But inside, you were tired of carrying, tired of asking for the bare minimum, tired of giving chances to people who only saw you when they needed something. And somewhere in that silence, you started shifting. The break didn't just shatter you. It started building something new, something firmer, something that no longer begs for kindness, that doesn't apologize for needing peace. You broke, not loudly, but completely. And that break is the reason you are different now, not harder, just more aware, more protective, more selective. They'll say you changed. They'll say you're cold now. But they won't mention the nights you cried without reason, the days you couldn't breathe but still showed up, the moments you sat alone, hoping someone would ask how you were. But no one ever did, so you broke in silence. And from that silence, something unshakable started growing. You weren't weak, you were soft. There's a difference. But they never knew how to hold softness without bending it. You showed up with open hands, and they saw that as a lack of strength. You listened when they were cold. You stayed when they pushed. You forgave when they didn't even say sorry. You just wanted peace. That was the mistake. They thought wanting peace meant you couldn't handle war. You didn't love wrong. You just loved the wrong people. People who saw kindness as an advantage. People who used your forgiveness as fuel. You didn't want conflict, so you bit your tongue, smiled through pain, gave them the benefit of every doubt, and they took that as an invitation to keep hurting you, because you didn't push back, because you didn't scream, because your silence made them feel safe. You gave more than they ever deserved. You listened to half explanations, accepted half effort. You told yourself it was just a phase, that maybe they were just damaged, that maybe if you just loved them a little louder, they'd finally treat you right. But it never came. They never changed. And you kept shrinking to make them comfortable. You weren't naive. You were hopeful. That's not weakness. That's just how soft hearts survive. By believing maybe this time will be different. But hope can be heavy when it's always landing in the wrong hands. And yours were full of weight that wasn't yours to carry. You kept carrying it anyway. They mocked your softness when it didn't serve them. Said you cared too much, felt too deeply, took things too personally. They laughed when you cried, rolled their eyes when you tried to explain how you felt. You learned quickly that vulnerability around the wrong people becomes ammunition. You gave them your heart, and they weaponized it. There were days you looked in the mirror and questioned yourself, wondered if maybe you really were the problem. Maybe you really were too sensitive. Maybe if you could just harden up, everything would be okay. But you weren't built to be cold. You weren't made to be indifferent. You tried to change, but it broke you. Because being soft was never the problem. Being unprotected was. They didn't value the quiet strength it takes to stay kind in a world that feeds off ego. They didn't see the effort behind every time you stayed calm when you wanted to break. Every time you chose patience over retaliation. They thought you were spineless, that you lacked boundaries, but they didn't see the war you were fighting inside your own mind just to keep the peace. Your softness was grace. It was power held with restraint. It was love that didn't demand, didn't manipulate, didn't threaten to leave when it didn't get its way. But they were so used to chaos that peace felt boring. So they tested you again and again. And when you didn't react the way they expected, they called you weak. You started hiding your heart. You stopped expressing what hurt. You stopped asking for effort, not because you didn't need it, but because you were tired of begging. You learned to expect nothing. That's what their version of love taught you. If you stay soft, you'll stay hurting. So you adapted. You didn't become hard. You became quiet. They noticed the change. When you stopped showing emotion, when your replies got shorter, when you stopped initiating. But they didn't ask why. They just blamed you, said you were different, said you weren't the same anymore. And they were right. You weren't, because the softness they crushed turned into silence, and that silence became your protection. You started giving your kindness to yourself. That was the shift. You realized you couldn't keep pouring into people who only showed up when it was easy. You stopped waiting for them to value what you were giving. You stopped begging people to see your heart. You learned that people who can't meet your softness with presence don't deserve access to it. You still care. You still feel deeply. But now, you choose who sees it, who earns it. You don't give it freely anymore. That's not bitterness. That's wisdom. Pain taught you that not everyone deserves access to the most vulnerable parts of you. You can still be soft, but now you come with boundaries. They don't get to call you weak now, because the version of you they knew, the one who stayed too long, who cried behind closed doors, who wrote long messages trying to explain themselves, that version doesn't exist anymore. You buried them the moment you realized your softness was being used as a playground. Now they watch from a distance. They don't know how to reach you anymore, because you no longer seek validation. You don't need to prove you're worth loving. You don't need them to see you. You see yourself, and that's where the strength is. That's what they missed. That the softest hearts are also the ones that know how to disappear when it's time. You didn't become cold. You became careful. You still have love in you, but now it's protected. Now it's guarded. Not because you've changed, but because they never deserved who you were. And the next time someone calls you weak, they won't get a reaction. They'll get distance. Because softness isn't weakness. It's power, controlled, selective, quiet, and untouchable. You saw everything, every joke they made at your expense, every smirk when you shared your plans, the look in their eyes when you spoke with hope and they responded with sarcasm. They thought you didn't notice, that you were too naive, too soft, but you did. You noticed it all. You just didn't respond. Not then. You were the quiet one, the one they overlooked, the one who got talked over in conversations, the one who got invited last, or not at all. They laughed louder when your voice cracked. They offered fake encouragement when you failed, and silence when you started to succeed. They thought silence meant you didn't see it, but you were just watching, recording, learning. You were the type to replay conversations in your head. The tone, the pauses, the way people looked at you when they thought you were too small to be taken seriously. You kept receipts, not to expose anyone, but to remind yourself where not to return. You didn't keep them to hold grudges. You kept them as reminders of who stood beside you, only when it was easy. They underestimated you because you didn't fight back, because you didn't clap back with loud words or dramatic exits. You just took a step back. You let them think they were winning. You let them believe you were too weak to stand up. They thought your silence was agreement, that your stillness was surrender, but it wasn't. You were studying them the way surgeons study anatomy, quiet, precise, detailed, nothing missed. They didn't see the nights you stayed up researching while they were out laughing. They didn't see the way you poured yourself into your work when they called your dreams a phase. You were building while they were mocking. You were investing in yourself while they were performing. Every insult, you turned into motivation. Every doubt, you turned into discipline. You weren't wasting energy explaining yourself. You were using it to evolve. You remember how they switched up depending on who was around. The fake smiles in front of people, the coldness in private. They thought you were too blind to notice, but you did. You just chose to stay quiet because you knew you couldn't argue someone into being genuine. You can't teach loyalty. You can't fix envy. So you started moving different. Slowly, you stopped sharing your plans. You stopped showing your effort. You stopped needing their approval. You let them underestimate you while you kept growing. That was the advantage. They never saw it coming. They were too busy mocking what they didn't understand. They thought you were weak because you didn't defend yourself every time they tried to cut you down. But you knew the truth, that real strength isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the kind that endures, that stays focused, that builds in the background. You didn't need to win the moment. You were after something bigger. You kept your circles small, started spending more time with yourself, less explaining, more execution. You gave up trying to be liked. You stopped performing softness for people who only knew how to throw stones. They called you antisocial, cold, distant, but really, you were just healing, cleaning the wounds they caused, alone with your own hands. You let them talk, you let them pretend, because while they were busy underestimating you, you were becoming someone they'd never recognize. You were collecting every failure and turning it into fuel. You were stacking every dismissal like bricks and turning them into your foundation. You didn't need validation. You needed time. They assumed the silence meant defeat, that you gave up. But really, you just stopped inviting the wrong people to witness the rebuild. They didn't get front row seats to your comeback. They lost that right when they chose ego over empathy, when they laughed instead of listened, when they talked down instead of helping up. You knew one day they'd act like they always believed. They'd say they knew you had it in you. But you'll remember every ignored message, every fake compliment, every time they tried to make you feel small so they could feel important. That's not bitterness. That's clarity. You saw how quickly they supported strangers, how they shared and praised people who never gave them anything, while they stayed silent during your hardest days. That taught you something. That taught you where your value was invisible. And once you learned that, you never unsee it. You stopped trying to force people to notice what they're committed to ignoring. You were never clueless. You were just focused. Let them keep thinking you were behind. Let them believe they broke you. That's fine. You let them sleep on you while you worked in silence. You let them look away while you transformed. Because real growth doesn't need to be seen to be real. It just needs to happen. Now you don't flinch when you hear their names. You don't feel the need to prove anything. You don't seek revenge. Your glow-up isn't a warning shot. It's a full rebuild. Quiet, strong, consistent, and the best part, they still don't know how you did it. Because they weren't paying attention. They were too busy calling you weak, too busy performing confidence while you were becoming it. They can't laugh now, not the same way, because you were watching, recording, learning, and now that you've stepped forward, they can't figure out how you got here. But you know, you've always known. You just stopped telling them. It didn't start with a big moment. No yelling, no slammed doors, no public breakdown. Just small decisions you started making for yourself. Quiet changes, invisible to most, but to you, they meant everything. You stopped answering every message right away, not out of spite, just because your peace mattered more than their urgency. You used to drop everything to make people feel heard. Now you paused, now you asked yourself if you even wanted to respond. You stopped chasing, stopped checking in with people who never asked how you were doing. You realized you were always the one holding the connection, always the one reaching out. So you stopped, and the silence that followed told you everything. They didn't check back, didn't ask if you were okay, and that silence said more than any conversation ever could. You pulled your energy back, slowly, carefully, without announcement. You gave less of yourself to conversations that only drained you. You started showing up differently, more reserved, more focused. You sat in the same rooms, but your mind was elsewhere. Not lost, just clear. They noticed. They sensed the shift. People always do. They don't say anything, but they feel when your energy isn't as available as it used to be. They started asking questions, subtle ones. Why are you so quiet? Why don't you come around anymore? You smiled, kept it vague. You didn't owe them clarity, not anymore. You had spent years explaining yourself to people who never really listened. Now, you let your distance speak for you. You ate alone more often, not because you were lonely, but because you were learning to enjoy your own company. You weren't shrinking, you were centering, rebuilding, choosing yourself, meal by meal, minute by minute. The table was quieter, but your mind was louder. You thought about things differently now. Your goals, your patterns, your peace, all of it finally had your full attention. You worked harder, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you never needed their approval. You stayed late, pushed further, showed up even when it was hard. You poured into your future like no one was watching, because honestly, no one was. They only look when you shine. But that's fine. You weren't doing it for the claps. You were doing it because building something for yourself was the only way out. You spoke less, not because you had nothing to say, but because you realized not everyone deserves access to your thoughts. You stopped over-explaining, stopped defending your decisions. You let people sit with their assumptions. You didn't need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. Your silence was no longer insecurity, it was power. It wasn't about becoming cold. You still cared. You still loved deeply. You still felt everything. But now you were selective about who got to experience that part of you. You weren't building walls. You were building boundaries. Big difference. Before, everyone got access. Now, access had a cost. Respect, consistency, effort. The people who were used to the old you, the always apologizing version, started getting uncomfortable. They couldn't predict you anymore, couldn't use your emotions against you. You didn't give them anything to twist. That unsettled them, but you didn't care. You were finally choosing peace over performance. You didn't announce the shift. You just made it real, day by day. You stopped responding to things that made you feel small. You unfollowed accounts that triggered self-doubt. You stopped answering questions that were asked just to stir up drama. You didn't argue anymore, didn't correct people's twisted versions of the past. You let it be. And that's what real power looks like. Letting people be wrong about you while you keep building. Some people tried to pull you back, to test if the new you was just temporary. But you didn't react. You didn't send long messages. You didn't fight for clarity. You just let them wonder, the same way they made you wonder for years. Now they felt it too, the confusion, the distance, the absence. And still you said nothing. You learned that quiet doesn't mean weak. It means done. It means healed. It means you're no longer emotionally invested in proving your worth to people who only ever saw what they could take from you. You didn't move with resentment. You moved with clarity. That's what made it so powerful. There was no grudge, just clean distance. You stopped waiting for people to change. Stopped hoping they'd wake up and finally understand what they had. You stopped looking for closure in the people who broke you. The shift wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual, mental, physical. You started protecting your energy like it was life or death, because it was. You slept better. You breathed deeper. You walked lighter, not because life got easier, but because you stopped carrying people who weren't meant to go where you were headed. The peace you started to feel wasn't accidental. It was earned. Every time you chose silence over chaos. Every time you said no to what used to get a yes. Every time you walked away without explaining why. You weren't looking for applause. You didn't post about your growth. You just lived it. Quietly, authentically. That's the part that confused them the most. You didn't need to prove the change. You became the proof, and that was enough. It didn't happen loudly. You didn't slam doors. You didn't write a final message. You didn't scream what they did to you. One day, you just got tired. Not angry, not hurt. Just done. And that kind of done doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It just walks away. You woke up and something inside felt different. You didn't check your phone like you used to. You didn't scroll through old messages trying to decode what went wrong. You didn't rehearse a reply in your head. You felt empty, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of empty that made space for clarity, for peace, for boundaries that didn't need to be spoken. The things that used to trigger you didn't anymore. The things you used to chase started to look small. You stopped worrying about how they'd react. You stopped replaying the disrespect. You stopped justifying their behavior in the name of, they didn't mean it. You stopped needing to be seen by people who were always looking through you. You didn't try to convince them this time. You didn't explain your silence. You didn't list the reasons you were walking away. You just stopped watering what never grew. You took your energy back without apology because you realized peace isn't found in fixing people. It's found in freeing yourself from the ones who don't think they need fixing. They didn't expect that from you. You were always the one to reach out first, always the one to fix things, always the one to carry conversations, make the effort, keep the bond alive. You were the one who forgave too soon, answered too quickly, loved too hard. They expected you to stay on repeat. But this time was different. Because this time you didn't care how it looked. You cared how it felt. You stopped reacting. And that shook them more than any confrontation ever could. You didn't match their passive aggression. You didn't respond to the silence with a paragraph. You didn't give them the satisfaction of watching you break again. You just moved around it, quietly, fully, like they were no longer part of your orbit. And they weren't. Anne, they couldn't read you anymore, couldn't figure out what changed. You were once an open book. Now you were closed, not out of spite, but because they stopped reading when the pages were bleeding. You gave your words to silence now. You stopped talking to people who only listened to argue. You stopped opening up to people who never held space for your truth. There's a shift that happens when you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood, when you no longer need someone to see your side. That's the moment you stop playing defense and start protecting your peace instead. You used to explain your intentions like they were fragile glass. Now you say nothing. Let them think what they want. You're not in the business of clearing up false perceptions anymore. They always thought strength looked like volume, like showing up in rage, like proving yourself over and over. But real strength is quiet. It's still. It's unbothered. It's knowing you could say everything, but choosing not to. It's the moment you stop needing closure from someone who never gave you clarity in the first place. You didn't block them. You didn't erase the past. You just stopped revisiting it. You didn't delete the photos, you just stopped staring at them. You didn't hate them. You just didn't have space for them anymore. Not in your heart. Not in your future. You outgrew the version of yourself that allowed them to stay too long. You weren't bitter. You were clear. You were no longer waiting for them to show up differently. You accepted who they were, and you moved accordingly. You started giving your time to people who didn't make you question your worth. You started choosing silence over drama, peace over chaos, distance over forced presence. They didn't recognize the new version of you because this version didn't react, didn't chase, didn't explain. This version made decisions based on how things felt, not how they looked. You weren't performing anymore, you were protecting, and that unsettled the ones who used to benefit from your lack of boundaries. You used to carry everything, the relationship, the guilt, the responsibility for their healing. You held all of it on your shoulders and called it love. But now, you let go of what wasn't yours. You returned to yourself. You created space for peace to live again. And it felt unfamiliar at first. But then, it felt like home. Letting go didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like loss. It felt like grief. But then came the lightness, the stillness, the steady breath you hadn't felt in months. You realized how much of yourself you had abandoned trying to make things work, how loud the silence was, but how honest it finally felt. You didn't need a new person to find healing. You needed space from the one who broke you and convinced you it was your fault. You stopped hoping they'd change, stopped needing them to admit they were wrong. You chose you. Not out of revenge, out of survival, out of exhaustion, out of truth. They thought you'd always be there, that no matter what, you'd come back, that you'd explain yourself again. But you didn't. You didn't leave a note. You didn't leave the door cracked. You walked out quietly and locked it behind you. Because you didn't need their permission to change. You just needed a reason, and they gave it to you. Over and over, until one day it was enough. They come back like nothing happened. A message, a comment, a random "how have you been?" Like the distance wasn't their choice. Like the silence didn't speak louder than any lie they ever told. They act soft now, careful, casual, but calculated. They don't say sorry. They say things like, "I was thinking about you," or "we should catch up." They test the waters because they know what they did and they know what they lost. You feel it before they even reach out. That shift, that energy, that pull, like they can sense your peace and want a piece of it again. But the version of you they're searching for doesn't exist anymore. The one who waited, who responded right away, who dropped everything to make room for people who only showed up when it was convenient. That version is gone, and the door they walked out of, it's locked now. They say they miss the old you. What they mean is they miss the access, the benefit of your presence, your softness, your effort, your patience. They miss being forgiven without earning it. Miss the safety of knowing you'd always come back, even when they never really showed up for you. They miss the light you gave without question, the warmth that kept burning even when they stood in the cold. But they don't miss you. They miss the version of you that made their ego feel safe. You're not angry. You're not carrying hate. You're not waiting to lash out. You've just outgrown the role they put you in, the one where your worth depended on being needed, the one where you had to shrink to fit their comfort zone. You've stopped explaining your silence, stopped overthinking their absence. You learned that real love doesn't have to be earned through sacrifice. So you stopped bleeding for people who called your pain too much. They try to come back with questions now. What happened to you? Why are you different? Are we still good? They want reassurance. They want to believe they still hold weight. But your tone doesn't bend anymore. Your energy is neutral. Not cold, not cruel, just inaccessible. You're not punishing them, you've just changed. And you're not explaining that change to people who didn't notice the damage while it was happening. There's a quiet revenge in healing, in growing, in not reacting. Not because you're pretending to be over it, but because you actually are. You remember everything, but you don't feel it the same. You've processed it, outlived it, and now you see them clearly, not as someone you lost, but as someone who was never really holding your hand in the first place. You gave them space, grace, patience. They filled it with games, silence, excuses. Now they want to come back to a home they helped burn down, and they're surprised you won't rebuild it. But how do you rebuild something you never had help carrying? You learned that love without reciprocity is just emotional labor. You were working alone while they played the victim. They say things like, "You've changed," and they're right, but not in the way they mean it. You didn't change to hurt them. You changed to stop hurting. You became who you had to be to survive the silence they left you in. You didn't ask for this shift. It was built in pain, in loneliness, in the cold aftermath of being left on red too many times. They called you strong once, but only when it benefited them, when you stayed after the disrespect, when you forgave without hesitation, when you bent until you snapped. Now they get boundaries. Now they get short replies or none at all. Now they see you post and wonder what you're thinking, who you're with, if you still care. They think they're being subtle, but it's obvious. The energy doesn't lie. They're not reaching out to rebuild. They're reaching out to reconnect to a power source they no longer have access to. But this version of you doesn't dim for people who walked away when the lights flickered. You're not cold. You're just done explaining your fire to people who only felt the warmth, but never respected the flame. You're not rude. You're just not performing anymore. You're not faking smiles. You're not reopening wounds. You're not trying to be the bigger person when the other side never even showed up to the conversation. They regret it quietly. They won't say it. They'll call it nostalgia, call it curiosity. But beneath that is the awareness that they lost something solid, something they couldn't find in surface-level connections, something rare, you, and it's too late. Because the door they used to walk through like they owned it, it's not just closed, it's gone. They miss the old you, the one they could call at 2 a.m., the one who would always say it's okay when it wasn't, the one who waited for them to choose better. That version is buried in every unanswered call, every broken promise, every apology that never came. That version had hope. This version has self-respect. You don't hate them. You just don't need them. You don't miss them. You miss the peace you thought they'd bring. But now you have that peace without them. And they can feel that in every unanswered message, in every missed opportunity, in every moment you choose silence over reopening the cycle. You don't chase. You don't explain. You don't hope they see your worth anymore. You know your worth now. And when you know it, you stop offering it to people who only saw it when it was too late. They want access, but they're locked out. Not because you want to punish them, but because the version of you they're looking for no longer exists. They won't say it, not out loud, not in words, but you can feel it. It's there, in the tension when your name comes up, in the way they pause before speaking, in the way they act like they didn't notice your glow-up, but you know they did. They always do. Regret doesn't always come dressed in apologies. Sometimes it wears silence, awkward smiles, passive likes, indirect messages through people you no longer keep close. They still watch you, from a distance now, from the outside, where access no longer exists. They watch you move with peace, with focus, with a kind of strength they never believed you had. They watch you shine in ways they once tried to dim. And they hate it, not because you've changed, but because you didn't need them to. They don't admit they lost something valuable, but they know. It hits them at night, when the noise fades and they sit alone with their choices. That's when it stings. That's when they remember the way you showed up, the way you stayed when they gave you every reason to leave, the way you offered your full self, flawed, real, patient, and asked for nothing but honesty in return. They know you were solid. They know you were rare. They know they mistook your silence for weakness. They know they disrespected your presence while feeling entitled to your loyalty. But pride won't let them admit it, so they stay quiet. They pretend. They act unbothered. But their energy betrays them. You notice it in the way they shrink when you enter the room. The forced calm, the overcompensated coolness, the fake congratulations, the sudden friendliness that wasn't there when you were breaking. Now they show up with smiles, acting like nothing happened. But everything happened, and you haven't forgotten any of it. They regret what they said. what they didn't say, the calls they ignored, the chances they wasted. They remember every moment they chose ego over empathy, distance over accountability. They remember how you tried to hold it together for both of you, how you stayed soft even when they were careless. They didn't expect you to detach, thought you'd always come back, that no matter how many times they pushed, you'd stay. But you didn't. You left. Not with chaos, but with clarity. You removed yourself from a cycle that kept you small. And now, they sit in the silence they once used to control you. They thought you'd break without them, but you built something better instead. You built peace, discipline, focus, boundaries. Now, they look for pieces of you in people who won't match it. They search for your loyalty in people who don't even know how to spell the word. And it frustrates them, but they keep pretending. Their regret doesn't sound like, "I'm sorry." It sounds like, "You've changed." It sounds like, "We were just young." It sounds like, "You were too much." They rewrite the past to make themselves feel better. But even their new version of the story can't erase how they lost something real. Something that doesn't come around twice. You see it in their eyes, when they don't know what to say to you anymore, when their confidence fades for a second, when they realize you're no longer trying to fill the silence with forgiveness. You don't ask how they've been. You don't ask if they're okay. And that quiet, that's louder than anything you could have said. They regret how they treated you, but they'll never say it. They'll act like you both moved on, like you both changed, like time just took its course. But you know better. Time didn't take you. They pushed you. And now they feel the consequences in your absence. You were the safe space, the one who held them together when they were falling apart. The one who gave love without calculating the return. The one who would have stood beside them through anything. But they broke that. And now they're on the outside, watching what they used to have, knowing they can't reach it anymore. They try to act unaffected, try to keep the upper hand, but it slips through their fingers every time they hear about you doing well. Every time they hear someone mention your name with respect, every time they realize you didn't just move on, you leveled up and did it without them. You don't need their recognition. You're not waiting for it, but you can feel it. It follows you, in the way they linger near conversations about you, in the way they watch your stories seconds after you post, in the way they stay connected to people around you, hoping for updates. They don't want you back. They want back the version of you they destroyed, and they know they can't have it. You loved them in a way most people never will again. You gave them a front row seat to your soul. They threw it away. And now, they sit in seats they no longer deserve, watching you from a distance, wishing they had held on tighter. Regret is quiet when it's real. It doesn't always show up as an apology. Sometimes it just looks like distance filled with tension, words left unsaid, eye contact avoided, that subtle pain behind a fake smile. You recognize it now. You don't need them to say it. You already know. You used to think revenge meant getting even, saying what you couldn't say before, making them feel what you felt, matching their silence, returning their disrespect. You thought healing would come from watching them fall, but it didn't. It came when you stopped needing any of that, when you stopped looking back, when you stopped waiting for the apology you already knew would never come. You don't talk about them anymore, not out of fear, out of peace. Their name doesn't live in your mouth. You don't bring them up in every conversation. You don't replay what happened like a movie that never ends. They exist in the past now, quietly, and that silence says more than revenge ever could. You don't hate them, not even close. You just don't feel anything anymore. The hurt got tired. The anger burned itself out. What's left is distance, space that can't be crossed. They can stand right in front of you and still not reach you. That's not bitterness. That's closure they didn't give you, so you gave it to yourself. They never thought you'd change. They thought you'd always be emotional, always be available, always be the one who came back, explained, defended, softened. But you didn't need to scream to show them they lost you. You just started showing up for yourself, quietly, consistently, and that's when they felt it. You became the consequence, not the loud kind, not the kind that shows up to make a scene. You became the one that grew without them, that healed without closure, that loved without needing their approval, that built something they can't touch. That's punishment enough, watching you rise while knowing they had a front row seat and still chose to look away. You didn't glow up to get even. You grew because staying small was killing you. You changed your circle, changed your patterns. You stopped arguing, you stopped explaining, you stopped waiting. You became consistent, disciplined, focused. The version of you they see now, that's the version they couldn't break. And that's what stings. They don't know how to reach you anymore. Not because you're hiding, but because you've elevated. They don't know what to say, because nothing they say can shake you. You no longer need their approval. You no longer react to their absence. You no longer confuse their interest with their investment. They say growth is the best revenge, but it's more than that. Growth is the silence they can't decode, the peace they can't disrupt, the strength they can't claim. You didn't become someone else. You became who you were before they taught you to doubt yourself. You don't show off your progress. You don't flash it around. You just live it. And they see it. They scroll past it, hear about it, feel it in the way people talk about you now, in the way you carry yourself, in the way you don't chase what doesn't align. And that quiet shift, that's what gets them. They used to hold your emotions like power. They knew how to trigger you, how to get under your skin, how to leave just enough space for hope. But now, they throw stones into a still ocean. Nothing ripples. Nothing reacts. There's nothing left to pull on. You became grounded. You stopped breaking at their silence. You stopped softening just because they remembered you exist. You realized that forgiveness doesn't require reconnection. That healing doesn't mean they get a second chance. You stopped confusing love with access, and now you love without opening the door. They expect a version of you that no longer exists, the one who made excuses, who waited, who forgave without change. But this version left without needing them to understand. You outgrew the conversations, outgrew the explanations, outgrew the emotional debt. They're not suffering because you wanted them to. They're suffering because they lost someone who genuinely cared, someone who would have stayed through storms, who held them down when they didn't deserve it, who showed love they never earned, and now they have to live with the fact that they threw that away. You didn't slam the door. You just stopped leaving it cracked. You stopped answering. You stopped hoping. You started protecting your energy like it was the last thing you had left. And in that protection, you found yourself. You found peace. Power, focus. Your healing became sacred, off limits, not to be shared with those who helped break you. Let them think you're distant. Let them call it ego. They don't get to understand this version of you. They didn't take care of the last one. They disrespected your softness, took advantage of your patience, mocked your loyalty, and now they miss it. Not because they changed, but because you did. You don't post for attention. You don't explain your moves. You don't need to make them see what they lost. They already know. They may never say it, but they feel it. In your silence, in your elevation, in your absence. You're not hoping they hurt. You're hoping they learn. Learn how to value someone before it's too late. Learn what it feels like to be on the other side of silence. You didn't hurt them. They hurt themselves when they called your strength weakness, when they mistook your peace for passivity, when they thought you'd never leave. Now you walk like you've got nothing to prove, because you don't need revenge. You became it. They called you weak because they saw you quiet, because you didn't fight back the way they expected, because you didn't match their chaos. They looked at your silence and assumed it meant surrender. They saw your kindness and thought it meant you were soft. But they didn't see the war going on inside. They didn't see you trying to keep yourself from breaking. They didn't know that your stillness was survival. You were surviving. That's what they didn't understand. You weren't weak. You were carrying weight no one could see. Smiling when you wanted to scream, showing up when you wanted to disappear, listening while you were drowning in your own noise. You were putting everyone else's needs above your own, and still they said you were too sensitive, too emotional, too quiet, too nice. As if any of that was a flaw. They didn't know what it cost you to stay calm, to stay kind. They only saw your reactions, not the self-control it took to bite your tongue, to forgive, to walk away from battles you had every right to fight. They only measured your strength by how loud you were, how visibly angry. But the truth is, anyone can scream. Not everyone can stay composed in the face of disrespect and still choose peace. You were healing from things you never spoke about, from wounds that didn't bleed but never fully closed. They didn't know you were holding yourself together with threads, that every day was a decision to keep going. They didn't know how much effort it took just to function. You were showing up in spaces that never felt safe, giving people chances they never earned, hoping that if you loved them right, they'd finally see you. You gave too many chances. That's the part that hurt most. You kept your hands open to people who were only there to take. You let them back in, again and again, because you wanted to believe people could change. You wanted to believe they meant well, even when their actions said otherwise. And still, they called you weak, for loving, for trying, for choosing connection over conflict. But now you're different. You're not cold. You're not cruel. You're just done explaining, done making space for people who take you for granted. You're calm. You're focused. You don't respond the way you used to. You don't react just because someone expects it. You've learned that not everything deserves your energy, that peace isn't found in being right. It's found in not needing to prove anything anymore. You stopped chasing people who made you feel hard to love. You stopped lowering your standards to keep people close. You stopped waiting for validation. You validate yourself now. You don't need to be loud to be strong. Your power comes from discipline, from knowing your worth without screaming it, from walking away without needing to be heard. The ones who used to mock your softness now try to copy your strength. They see the glow up, the calm, the discipline. They see how you hold your boundaries now, how you speak with purpose, how you don't flinch when they test you. But what they can't replicate is the pain that built you, the nights you cried yourself to sleep, the mornings you had to drag yourself out of bed, the silence you had to sit with, the healing you had to do alone. They want your results, but not your process. They want your strength, but not your struggle. They imitate your confidence, but it's hollow. Because real confidence isn't performance. It's quiet. It's steady. It's knowing who you are when no one is clapping. It's continuing anyway. They watch now, some from afar, some still pretending they never called you weak, some trying to come back, acting like they always knew you'd make it. But you remember who laughed, who doubted, who disappeared when you needed them most. You don't carry hate, but you don't forget. That version of you might have needed their approval. This one doesn't. That's just, you're not who you were. And that's the part that stings for them. They can't reach you now, not emotionally, not mentally, not spiritually. You've built walls, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You've created a space where peace lives and chaos can't enter. You're not triggered the way you used to be. The things that once made you feel small now remind you of how far you've come. You became unshakable, not because life got easier, but because you got stronger. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped begging to be understood. You learned that silence can be power, that solitude can be healing, that walking away is strength, not weakness. They regret it now.